Good afternoon, and thank you for joining Bruce County Public Library for this live presentation. My name is Nancy Cool, and I'm the program coordinator for Bruce County Public Library. And today we welcome Jackie Campbell, a Master Gardener with Grey County Master Gardeners. Master Gardeners are trained volunteers who offer non-biased, science-based horticultural information and advice to home gardeners and community groups, and Master Gardener groups exist all over Ontario. In today's session, Jackie will share general information about the environment in which you garden, as well as specific conditions in your own property, the characteristics of the various plants that you will encounter as a gardener, and planting and maintaining your garden. So this is for beginners. It's gardening for beginners, what every gardener needs to know and is afraid to ask. So we do ask that you submit questions along the way. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. As I mentioned, we encourage you to submit any questions or comments to our web form on the Bruce County Public Library website, and you should be able to see that link on your screen here or in the comments during the presentation, and we'll be monitoring for your questions throughout, and we'll address any questions following the presentation. You may wish to take this opportunity to grab a pen and a piece of paper to jot down any information and take some notes. If you don't get a chance to watch live, this presentation will be recorded and posted here on the library's YouTube channel in our special guests playlist. And you will find the recording there so you can watch it later or share it with your friends and family. And if you haven't already, remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel to keep up to date with all our live presentations. So following today's event, we encourage you to fill in our short evaluation form. Just takes a couple of minutes. The link is in the description for the event on our website. Your feedback and stories help show the value of what the library does in our communities. So on to Jackie. Jackie moved to Grey County from Oakville in 2003, and she joined the Grey County Master Gardeners as an MGIT, a Master Gardener in Training, in 2004. And she became a Master Gardener in 2006 after obtaining a certificate of horticulture from Guelph University. Her and her husband grow perennials, vegetables, and herbs on their property in Allen Park, which is between Hanover and Durham. So we are very excited and pleased to welcome you today, Jackie, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Nancy. I hope that the title Gardening for Beginners doesn't turn some people away, because it is a basic. It does provide you with basics. But I'm hoping that it kind of consolidates the information and the knowledge that people really need to get going on gardening. So I'm happy to be with you today. And I should also say that even though we call ourselves the Grey County Master Gardeners, that title is a little misleading, because in the last number of years, we also serve the communities in Bruce as well. The first section that I'm going to talk about is the things that you really need to know that are in your environment. So in the area around you, in not just your community, but the area that will affect your gardening. And the three big things here are: what is your hardiness zone? What are the frost dates? And that's the first frost date that you can expect in the fall, and the last frost date that you can expect in the spring. Also the direction of your prevailing wind. Well, actually, not your prevailing wind, the direction of the prevailing wind in your area. The website link, or the address that I provided there, is a fun one, because if you use that, so if you get a chance, take it down. If you use that, it actually takes you into a screen where you can see that it lists the municipalities in Ontario alphabetically, and you can either scroll down or key in the first few letters of your town, and it actually gives you your hardiness zone. So you don't have to be squinting at tiny maps, which certainly I have difficulty with. Hardiness zone is very important if you're going to be growing perennials. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about perennials a little later in the presentation. But these are basically plants that come back year after year. At least you hope they do. And So a hardiness zone is a number that indicates the, sorry, I'll back up. We in Gray and Bruce tend to be either 5A or 5B. So when you're buying perennials, you want to buy a plant that shows that that's its zone. And with any luck, you should be able to overwinter it. Now, Canadian hardiness zones are interesting in that it's not just temperature. There's actually a number of variables, which, yes, includes minimum temperature in the winter, but it also includes things like the amount of snow we get. It does indicate when the first and last frost dates are. A lot of these variables have gone into developing the hardiness zone. And this makes it very difficult because a lot of the magazines that you may read or taking a look on the internet, they will often talk about US hardiness zones. And the two aren't really, they don't have a direct relationship because of the number of variables that are included in the Canadian hardiness zones. If you see a plant in a magazine and it shows a US hardiness zone, I would suggest that you try to find out what the Canadian hardiness zone is. Contact Master Gardeners, we can help you, or look on the internet. And if all else fails and you simply can't find a Canadian hardiness zone for that plant, err on the side of caution. If it says US 3, you're probably okay. If it says US 5, you're probably not. So I think I have said enough about hardiness zones. The other first and last frost. When, for your spring, for your last frost date in the spring, that's important because you need to know when it's safe to plant your tender plants. It was always where I grew up. I grew up south of Hamilton, and then of course we gardened in Oakville. So the 24th of May weekend was always that big day when you went out and planted the tender plants. Then I moved up here, and I discovered that I now count on sort of the 1st of June as being the last frost date. Now I'm probably being conservative, but I certainly don't count the 24th of May as being safe anymore. The other thing about first and last frost dates, especially first frost dates, is you can have a plant that is hardy, but perhaps because the last frost date in the spring is later than the plant likes, you'll find that the plant survives, but it won't flower because you get flower buds that can be killed by that last frost if it's later. So we've had a lot of questions about forsythias, for example. You know, they flower very, very early, and they flower on buds that are formed on the previous year's growth. And we have had many years where I have a forsythia here where it looks green and lush when the leaves finally come, but it just doesn't flower. And that's because this last frost date in the spring is late enough or early enough. Sorry, the forsythia is early, the frost date is late, that it nips those flower buds. The other thing that you really need to have a good idea is your wind direction. You'll often buy a shrub and there'll be perhaps written on the label, put in a sheltered location. Well, if you don't know where your sheltered location is, if you don't know where your wind direction is, it's hard to tell where those sheltered areas in the garden are. You also need to know what you have in your own garden. And the two things that you really need to get an idea of here are what light do you have, what light exposure, and what is your soil like? Because these are much more affected by your very local conditions. So there's basically three categories of light. Now, full sun, it's defined as 6 or more hours a day. So in fact, that's probably less than a lot of people think. When they think, oh, I have to have full sun, they're thinking they have to have sun all day. And that isn't true. 6 hours a day is considered in gardening terms as being full sun. Partial sun, partial shade, you can kind of mush them together. But again, on plant labels, they will talk about partial sun, and that's usually defined as between 4 and 6 hours, where partial shade is just that little bit less. And full shade is less than 2 hours of sun in a day. Now, what is interesting about full shade is depending on the kind of shade you have, you can often grow things like bulbs, which again, we're going to talk about a little later. You can grow those spring bulbs because when they want to flower, if your shade is due to deciduous trees, the trees are not in leaf yet, and you will get filtered sun through the trees. So when you think you have full shade, don't sort of give up on having some early spring flowering plants. The other thing about your light is that it can also depend on the time of day. Noon sun, of course, is the strongest. And in the morning sun, actually, is my preference. I really like morning sun because especially as our days seem to be getting hotter in the summer, it provides light but not excessive heat. And I'm finding that a lot of plants are starting to prefer that morning sun. Afternoon sun, so if your 6 hours are sort of noon and in the afternoon, that's probably the heat. So you're not only getting light, you're getting a lot of heat, which plants, again, as I say, with global warming and our more extreme temperatures now, take that into consideration. You're going to see me staring down occasionally. It's because I do have some notes, and I just don't want to forget to tell you something that I might have written down. I'm not dozing off. Soil. Now this is when we lived in Oakville, we had Oakville is famous or infamous for its clay soil. So I developed a hatred of clay soil. But when we moved up here, we're on a patch of land that is sort of, I guess you'd call it a sandy loam. And it was just heaven for me, just heaven. Anyway, soil is usually a combination, and I'm oversimplifying, okay? But it's usually a combination of these three various types. Sand. Now, sand has advantages. It's easy to work with, unlike that Oakville clay that I developed my gardening skills on. And it drains very well. Drainage is a real factor in overwintering perennial plants. Because if your drainage is poor, water stays around the roots, in the soil around the roots, and ice crystals can form around the roots. And that is a death knell for plants. So, but it doesn't retain moisture, which is good and bad, as I say. And also, because it drains so rapidly, nutrients can leach out and get beyond the reach of your plants. Now, clay, it is really difficult to cultivate, and it also has the potential of being poor drainage. So the soil stays often moist to wet, or in the summer when we have droughts, it can be just like cement. One advantage of clay soil, though, is it does retain nutrients. And the odd plant actually prefers clay soil. Roses prefer soil which is on the clay side because it can retain nutrients. Now, loam is the most desirable soil. It's easy to work with, it drains well, but it also holds nutrients, unlike sand. Unless you're very, very lucky, though, and have loam soil, most of your soil is going to be part one. It's going to be a real mixture. Okay. Now, what type of soil? Talked about the variables that go into your soil. Well, one very basic and quick way to determine it is what we call the squeeze test. So take a handful of moist soil and just give it a squeeze. And if it falls apart, you have sand. If it stays together, even if you try to poke it, you probably have clay soil. But if it's kind of like a chocolate cake, you know how a well-made chocolate cake, it'll crumble, then you've got loam. And you are the envy of every gardener, especially the ones that garden in Oakville. I can still see that. Awful soil. If you have clay or if you have sand, there are ways you can improve your soil. And I have listed only one: compost. Whether it's your own, whether you're where you happen to be, whether your municipality has it, or whether you have to buy it, it is good no matter what your soil is like. So sandy soil, it will help it retain moisture. It will help it retain the nutrients that can leach out otherwise. It also can improve the drainage of clay soil. And how it does that, it actually kind of acts to separate the molecules of the clay soil. And it also will supply nutrients to all sorts of soils. So compost is probably the best thing you can use to improve your soil. If you have really, really tough clay soil, you can also use sand. Try to get very coarse sand, though, because what you're wanting is something to put space in the soil. And some people recommend peat moss to help with clay soil. My preference isn't peat moss. I have always found that unless you're very careful to keep it moist before you add it to your soil, it can form kind of a hard layer on top, which actually will resist water. So I'm not a really big fan of peat moss. The other factor of soil is its pH, and that is a measure of whether your soil is acid, the lower, or possibly alkaline. And this is measured on a scale that ranges from 0 to 14. So in the 6 to 8 range, your soil is around a neutral. Anything lower, the lower numbers, your soil can be acidic. And the higher numbers, it's starting to become alkaline. In Gray and Bruce, our bedrock, the pH of soil is dependent on a lot of factors. But one of the governing factors is what kind of bedrock is in the area. And in Grey and Bruce, of course, we are on the Niagara Escarpment. And the Niagara Escarpment is limestone. So it's very unusual that you will encounter acidic soil in Grey and Bruce. It tends to be in the neutral to possibly mildly acidic range. As I say in the next slide, how do you tell the pH of your soil? Well, there's a few ways you can do it. A soil analysis is the best way to do it, and a soil analysis by an accredited lab is the sort of Cadillac. In addition to revealing what your pH is, it also will analyze what kind of nutrients are in the soil, so that you have an idea there, you know that what you're missing, if you're missing anything. The website right at the bottom, and I hope you can read this, I hope I put the print big enough. It's the OMAFRA website. And the OMAFRA, and oh gosh, I probably can't remember what it stands for, Ontario Municipality of Agriculture and Food, and I think the R stands for regional something. But anyway, it's commonly known as OMAFRA. A marvelous website. But my only complaint about the OMAFRA website is it is just so informative. There is so much information on it. It's very difficult, I find, sometimes to locate the information. So I've given you the actual screen at the bottom. That screen is the listing of the accredited labs in Ontario, if you want to go that route. There are home tests kits, and there are various retailers that will sell them. I believe Lee Valley does. Virtually any retailer which has a sort of garden section probably sells them. And the last one, a home test, this is just a fun, quick one. And you take 2 separate soil samples of about 1/4 cup each and mix them with distilled water. And that you want the water distilled because you don't want the minerals in the water to kind of mislead you on the test. So add vinegar to one and baking soda to the other. Vinegar, of course, is an acid. Baking soda is an alkaline. So, and your soil is alkaline if the mixture that has the vinegar in it bubbles. And your soil is acidic if the mixture that you've added the baking soda to it bubbles. And I guess if it doesn't do a darn thing, you probably are sitting right on the 7. But this is just kind of a fun test. Might be fun if you're trying to get your children interested in gardening, that would be a fun one for them to do. And as I'm repeating myself, but soil in Grey and Bruce tends to be neutral to mildly alkaline. There are exceptions, but it's very odd to find acidic soil in Grey or Bruce. People ask us questions about where in my yard should I grow blueberries? And my answer is always, don't grow them in your yard, grow them in Sudbury. And speaking of blueberries and rhododendrons, can I change the pH of the soil? And we have had that question. I'm actually not joking. A neighbor of mine was very insistent that she was going to grow blueberries. And she grew blueberries, and she amended her soil so that she could grow blueberries to lower the pH, to be acidic. And she amended her soil. And she amended her soil the next year, and she amended her soil the year after that, and the year after that, and not something I'd recommend. But lime will raise the pH of acidic soils. And you remember my saying that the Niagara Escarpment is limestone. And this is why Grey and Bruce tends not to have acidic soil. Acidic soil is lacking lime, which is not something that we are lacking. But if you uh, if you've had a soil analysis and you're one of those very rare spots and you have an acidic soil, lime is what is used to raise the pH. Peat moss, there's that peat moss again, or compounds containing sulfur can be used to lower the pH of alkaline soils. I always recommend, because I always think of that poor neighbor that kept she used peat moss and she kept having to add peat moss year after year after year. I'm a lazy gardener. I just normally would not want to do that. So I recommend really just working to change the pH if it's not in that 6 to 8 range that plants like. It's not just they like them. I should also explain that if you have very acidic or very alkaline soil, plants cannot use certain nutrients in the soil. So you really want them in that 6 to 8 range. I don't recommend changing pH to grow plants that just prefer conditions you can't provide. So you're always best to choose plants that suit your soil. And if you want to know that, I'll provide some contact information at the end. Ask a master gardener. Oh, one thing, just a quick example, actually. When I mentioned to you that if the pH is not in that 6 to 8 range, if it's highly acidic or highly alkaline, plants can have difficulty using certain nutrients, as well as there's other problems such as buildup of salts if it's alkaline. But I had an interesting to me anyway, experience with that. I had a question. This is a number of years ago. I'd done a presentation and someone came up afterwards with a question. And her question was that for some reason, her plants, the foliage all seemed to be turning red. Often that means that a plant has rust. And I sort of thought, well, maybe it's that it's rust. But she showed me a picture, and what she had was the foliage all had like a burgundy glow. It was very strange. And I did some research, and what it turned out to be is that her plants had difficulty using phosphorus. I'm going to be talking about soil fertility soon, but it couldn't use phosphorus. So I went back to her and I said, "Do you have a phosphorus deficiency?" And she said, "No, I don't. I had a soil analysis done, smart lady, and I have all the nutrients, the big nutrients that I need. That's not a problem at all." She said, "The only thing the soil analysis turned out was that our soil is highly alkaline." I think it was something like 11 on the pH scale. Well, at that level of alkalinity, plants are unable to use phosphates, the phosphorus that's in the soil. And I know she did not believe me. To this day, I know that the woman did not believe me, but that's true. So things aren't quite as open and shut as you might think. Talk about soil fertility. So if you think of soil, just to backtrack quickly, there's really the three main. Is it clay? Is it sand? Is it loam? Is it a mixture of everything? The second thing is the pH. Is it acidic? Is it alkaline? Or is it, lucky me, is it really in the range of neutral? And the last thing about soil is the fertility. The big three that plants need in the soil are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen it really promotes that healthy foliage. Phosphorus is required to stimulate flower growth and root formation. And potassium is that sort of, I always think of this as the hard worker that you really don't see, because it's responsible for the sort of internal reactions that the plant does to promote vigor, and a plant that you've heard the expression failure to thrive, that can sometimes be due to a deficiency of potassium, because it just isn't strong. It isn't tolerant of extreme temperatures. It isn't tolerant of drought or wetness. One common question that we get at advice clinics, when we could do advice clinics, I hope we can start to do that soon again, is I have a plant, my bush, my shrub, and it is really green and healthy, and it doesn't flower. And one of the most common things, and the question we always ask, is, do you fertilize? And the answer is often, oh, yes, yes, because the questioner may think that we're implying that they don't fertilize, and therefore the soil doesn't have enough nutrients. The question is really around, what do you fertilize with? Because the answer is often that they're using a fertilizer that is high in nitrogen. And so if your plants have wonderful bright green foliage and should flower but aren't, you might want to take a look at whether you have too much nitrogen and not enough phosphorus. Pardon me, I'm peeking at my notes. And I can go sources of the big three. And these are naturally occurring sources. One expression that you've probably read, and you certainly have heard master gardeners talk about, but I'm sure you've heard other gardeners and read in magazines, is feed the soil, don't feed your plants. So all master gardeners tend to recommend naturally occurring sources of the nutrients. I have nothing against the sort of commercial fertilizers. I use them, but I only use them in my containers. And that's because my containers have my annual flowers, and I want them to make a big blast. So a lot of the sort of commercial fertilizers, commercial is the wrong word, but the kind of balanced fertilizers that you buy, the Nutrigrow and those various kinds, they're wonderful for the containers because they often provide a real quick hit. And that's what I'm looking for my annuals. They're only going to last that summer. I really just want them to put on a show. So as I say, I have nothing against the Miracle Grows or anything like that. I do use them myself. But for my garden soil, I use the more naturally occurring sources because they feed the soil, and therefore it's a long-lasting thing. It's nutrients in the soil that when the plants need them, they're there. And for nitrogen, aged manure is a good one. My mother always swore by poultry manure, but that might have been because she raised hens, and so it was readily available. I don't know. Personally, manure is manure. I don't really have a favorite kind. And make sure it's aged, because fresh manure, if you're getting it from a farmer, like it can burn the plants. It also can have many, many, many weed seeds in it. So make sure it's aged. Another source is fish emulsion. Another source is blood meal. The For phosphorus, bone meal is a good source. I have some really old roses. When I mean old roses, I don't mean the old-fashioned kind. I mean just old in years, because they were here when we bought the house, and they were here when the people we bought the house from bought the house. So they're very old, and they just weren't flowering. And so I started to use bone meal on them, and I have them back flowering. Mind you, I'm not sure. I wouldn't rather do without them, but they're here and they're now flowering, so they like the phosphorus. Potassium. Compost can provide potassium, especially if you compost your banana peels. And if you think, I don't know if your doctor has ever told you that you should eat more bananas because it provides potassium. It's great if you're on high blood pressure pills, because that tends to flush potassium from your system. And bananas are a good source of potassium, and it resides in the peels. So if you use a lot of banana peels in your compost is going to provide potassium. By the way, though, when you're coming up with questions for Nancy and I for the end, please don't have any medical questions. That was my medical knowledge right there. Hardwood ashes. So if you have a fireplace or a wood stove, they can also be a source of potassium. And the only problem with them is, do be careful, because they can raise the pH of the soil. They can raise the alkalinity of the soil. And again, I'm repeating myself, but usually our soil in Grey and Bruce does not need to have its pH raised. The other source of potassium is muriate of potash, and this is actually a mineral. So, and you can get it at wherever you get your normal gardening supplies. Now, have I forgotten to tell you anything? Oh, there are other that we call macronutrients that are, and then there's micronutrients and sort of trace nutrients that you want in your soil. I'm not going to go into all of those. I will mention, though, I'll mention calcium and magnesium are two of what we would call macronutrients that are required. Calcium is not something that we need a lot of, because now you're going to get the limit of my scientific knowledge. Calcium carbonate is limestone, or it's lime. That's the chemical formula, or chemical words for lime. So we don't need a lot of calcium. Actually, another quick story, because I'm not sure she believed me on this as well. If you grow tomatoes, a lot of people grow tomatoes. A lot of people will have a problem with what we call blossom end rot. Blossom end rot is, believe it or not, it is lack of calcium, calcium deficiency. A friend of mine, it's the same friend that's trying to grow blueberries. Maybe she should be taking an agricultural course. And she called me one day and said, I have blossom end rot in her tomatoes. She wasn't consulting me medically again. My tomatoes have blossom end rot. She said, what's the problem? And of course, I'm a master gardener. I know the answer to this. You have a calcium deficiency. Okay, and we started to talk about something else. And then she came back to the subject and said, so I should add lime to my soil because I have a calcium deficiency. No, that's the last thing you do. If you happen to have blossom end rot and it's due to a calcium deficiency, there are two other reasons why you could have it. One is calcium requires moisture. It needs to be in a solution to be able to be of benefit to your tomato plants. So you're probably not watering enough, or not watering consistently enough. The other possible problem is you're tilling too close to the root. And our damaging the roots and they can't take up the calcium. So I apologize for veering off into a growing vegetable presentation, but it's just interesting to me as a gardener that something like a calcium deficiency can sort of spin off and off and off into a real analysis. It's not just an open and shut. Now on to the second part, and that's knowing your plants. And I'm going to talk about, again, I'm oversimplifying, but I'm going to talk about 4 different categories of plants. We talk about perennials, annuals, biennials, and bulbs. Perennials. The definition of perennial is that it has a life cycle of at least 3 years. And their means of reproduction can be seed, it can be creeping stems, or roots. So a perennial isn't, or an annual, it's not defined by the way it reproduces. When I was sort of a starting out gardener, for some reason I thought that annuals reproduced by seed and perennials, you could only reproduce them if you sort of divided them up. But as I said, that their method of reproduction is not what defines this. It's that they have a life cycle of at least 3 years. So they will produce seed every year, but they will come back for at least 3 years. And some examples of these, echinacea. And I certainly know echinacea reproduces by seed because I am terribly slow at deadheading. I don't deadhead my echinacea because I leave it for the birds because they quite like the seeds. So where I have 1 plant, the next year I have 4, the next year I have 8,000. Annuals. Now annuals are called annuals because they actually complete their life cycle from germination to producing seed again and dying in 1 season. Petunias, marigolds, they are examples of what we grow I grow them in my containers. But I think I forgot to tell you something about perennials. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back. I did. Perennials actually have main categories within themselves. One are these kind of perennials, the echinacea, the hostas, the monardas, the herbaceous. The other type of perennials, of course, are your woody perennials, your trees and your shrubs. So I just wanted to make sure I told you that. And it's your perennials that are very dependent on knowing your hardiness zone. Back to annuals. The other thing about annuals is we actually think of what I'll call tender perennials as annuals. And 2 examples of that are impatiens, and they're not actually geraniums, they're pelargoniums, but we tend to call them geraniums. We perhaps think of those plants as annuals. They're not. They're tender perennials that would be, they would overwinter if we were in zone 10 or 11. So you can actually, they are not limited to that annual life cycle. So you can take the geranium, the pelargonium that you have in your container in this year, and you can actually take it in the house, put it in a pot, overwinter it, bring it back outside the next year. Its life cycle is at least 3 years. It's just that if we happen to leave it outside for the winter, it's not going to be happy, not at all. just because the hardiness zone, our hardiness zone, is too cold. However, petunias and marigolds are true annuals. Now, are kind of fun because what they do is they have a 2-year life cycle for each individual plant. So they form a rosette of leaves the first year, and then the following year they produce the flowers, the seeds, and the individual plant dies. And some common biennials that we have are forget-me-not. If you have forget-me-not, you won't forget it because even though the individual plants complete their life in 1 year, they are prolific seeders, self-seeders, these 3 plants that I've mentioned. And so you think you have perennials because you have these plants come back, the flowers, the plants come back year after year after year, but it's not the same plant. That same plant actually dies after 2 years. You're getting the results of its bounteous spreading of seed. Now, when I think of bulbs, I think of the daffodils, I think of tulips. But there's a vast, bulbs are just a huge category because all they really are, the bulbs are an underground storage system that help the bulbs survive the dormant season. And bulbs include such things as corms, tubers, rhizomes, as well as what I'll call the true bulbs. So the things that I always thought of as bulbs, snowdrops, daffodils, tulips, the other sort of spring ephemerals are often bulbs. Bearded iris is actually a rhizome. They're hardy. Once they are planted, they tend to come up year after year. The next category is bulbs that come up in the summer, and they are also the hardy summer bulbs, such as the lilies. Most of there's a vast categories within that lily category as well, which I'm certainly not going to go on about. Then the third category are those tender summer bulbs. And they are things like dahlias, cannas, calla lilies, gladiola. Although I have heard people are saying now that, especially if you plant them maybe a little deeper, gladiola are hardy. They don't have to be lifted. Because most of your tender summer bulbs, unfortunately, they won't survive the winter here. And you do have to take them out of the ground in the fall after there is a frost and store them for the winter. I am a lazy gardener. I may have said that once before. And so I tended to avoid the tender summer bulbs because it's too much work. Unfortunately, he's no longer living, but a cousin of my mother's, we became quite close when the rest of the family died off. He was one of the younger cousins, and he ended up as the last of his generation. And he used to come and visit. He lived in an apartment, and he missed his house. He used to have a beautiful garden and a house. And when he moved to an apartment, he really missed it. So he used to come up here in the summer, and he always either brought plants or insisted that we went out and buy plants. Well, one year he came, bless his heart, he came with, I think it must have been about 100. I know it wasn't that many. It just seemed that many of dahlias and calla lilies. And I still have them, and I still lift them every fall, and I store them and put them out again in the spring. And I sort of mentally curse poor Jack every time I do it, but I still do it. It was, but other than that, I would not be doing that, I have to confess. Oh, just technically, peonies and daylilies can be considered bulbs as well, because what they also include those. If you've ever looked at a root, dug up a peony to split it, or a daylily, they have really fleshy roots, and that's the underground storage system for them. And I don't know if you've ever noticed, but old farmhouses, old neglected farmhouses, you'll often notice that peonies and daylilies are still alive in the garden, even after being neglected for years. And that's because of that underground storage system. Just the previous slide was rather dry. Here's a picture of a bevy of beautiful bulbs, and all different kinds. The ones that I always think of as bulbs, narcissus, tulips. A lot of people call you narcissus daffodils, tulips, hyacinths, those lovely spring blooming bulbs that are lovely until you have to leave the foliage to sit there and rot on its own. The bearded iris, oriental lily, and then my nemesis, the dahlias. They are beautiful. So the next section that I'm gonna try to impart some knowledge is actually planting your garden. And the main categories here that we're going to take a look at is when to plant, your soil preparation, how number and grouping of plants. I thought it might be fun to just kind of veer a little bit into kind of a design feature, how to plant, and spacing of your plants. Well, these are just some general guidelines about when I should plant. The best time to plant your perennials is in the spring, so that they get a good head start. Anytime after the ground can be worked, or else plant them in the fall. What you're trying to avoid is planting them in the hot summer. Now, in fact, if you're buying your perennials at a nursery, you can plant them in the summer because they are what is known as container grown. If you're dividing perennials or you're getting bits of a plant from a friend, this is when they really are best, in the spring or in the fall. And my quick rule of thumb is if a perennial, if you're dividing it, say, and moving it and replanting it, if it flowers in the spring, plant it in the fall. So divide it and move it in the fall. If it flowers in the fall, do it in the spring. It's so it can concentrate on developing its roots rather than having to concentrate on flowering and putting down new roots at the same time. It isn't a hard and fast rule, but it's just a bit of common sense. And of course, the annuals and your tender summer bulbs really should be, you need to wait until after that last frost in the spring. And you know what that is, don't you? Because that was one of the things about the general environment that you need to know. The spring blooming bulbs are planted in the fall, September and October. Oh, and well, I see it on the slide. Again, it's just kind of a rule of thumb that in the fall, 6 weeks prior to the first hard frost is kind of a good rule of thumb. Because if you plant your things, even if you can still work the soil, if you plant them too late, they don't have time to get established before we get the first hard frost. Trees and shrubs, either spring or fall, the same as your herbaceous perennials. Some trees really want to be planted in the spring, and I'm not going to try to provide a list, but if anybody that could, we have on the contact sheet at the end, do contact Master Gardeners, and I can see that you're provided with a list. Just, you might want to mention in your email that it's regarding this presentation. Now, soil preparation, important for perennials, of course, because you're not moving them all the time. Well, I have to confess, I move mine all the time. I regard them as sort of like furniture. You know, you should be able to move them around. My husband's always looking at me carting a perennial that I've dug up from one spot and decided it'll look better in one other spot. Leave the poor things alone. But I think they know I love them that way. But if you're a better gardener than I am, they do remain in the same place for multiple years. And so it is especially important. And again, especially with your perennials, try to ensure that planting area is as weed-free as possible and as free of grass, which is the thing that I battle most in my perennial flower beds. Then add, and we talked earlier about compost and the other soil amendments. Add them as necessary, but again, your soil test is the best way to determine if they're necessary, if anything is required. Grouping of plants. When you plant them, this sounds kind of silly, but you may have read this in magazines as well. If you plant in a group of odd-numbered plants, it tends to avoid having things kind of in a row. And design features, design tends to not like things in a row. The one plant, if you're planting something as an accent plant, and this slide shows the acanthus, or the common name is bear's breeches, it's a huge plant, and it really makes a statement. So you're going to want that on its own. And you're not going to want very many of them. You certainly wouldn't want more than one that you could see at the same time. You really want it to be an accent, something unusual. Before planting, whether it's a nursery grown plant or something that you've got in a pot, what is a good idea is to give it a really good soaking so that the roots are moist. Don't, because if you try to take it out of the pot and the roots aren't moist, the soil is going to drop all away. And also remove it from the plant, from the pot, and check that it isn't root bound, because that, I don't want to say it's a common problem in plants that you get from the nursery. It's not, but I mean, they do have them on hand often for quite a while. So there is the potential that they might be root bound. If they are, just try to loosen the root that's curling around the pot. Now, how to plant. Make sure that the hole you dig is deeper and wider, because you don't want the roots to be crowded. And if it's a big plant, you're going to kind of spread the roots around. I always add a little bit of compost to the hole. And when you put the plant in, try to adjust the depth so that the roots are completely covered, but the crown is above the soil line. So if you're planting something that's been in a pot, it's a little easier because you can tell pretty exactly where, planted at the same level. And then gently fill the hole with your soil and make sure that you're firming it up as you go, because if you get air spaces around the roots, that can create it will dry out. I was going to say it creates a drought. It doesn't actually create a drought. But with air spaces around the roots, that particular part of the root can dry out. And then give it a final water and use mulch. I'm going to talk a little bit more about mulch further on. Okay, you mulch about 3 inches, say 3 to 4 inches, but leave a space around the stem. You don't want the mulch right up touching the stem. Follow your guidelines on the label. And when the labels talk about plant this far apart, they're really talking about from one center of the plant to the other center of the plant, according to whatever width the label tells you the plant's going to be at maturity. If you're buying plants at a nursery, your labels are probably the best source of information. Now, I know lots of gardeners will recommend, and again, possibly in magazines and things, they'll talk about planting close together. They plant close together because it restricts weeds, that weeds don't have room to grow. Well, personally, that's never been my experience. I found weeds will grow any place, and if you've got your plants close together, all that happens is it just creates an awful mess because your weeds come up practically in your plants. But the other issue with planting too close together is you may not get good air flow. And there are diseases that just thrive on that. So things like mildew, it really likes things planted close together. So follow your labels. Do space. Concentrate on spacing well. That's on mulching. You need to apply, and there are a few different things that mulch does. The one is it does help control weeds if you put enough on. So put at least 3 inches. It's not some sort of magic bullet against weeds, though. I just want to caution you. I mean, I can mulch and go out the next day and there's weeds coming up, I swear. The best way that mulch works, of course, is it reduces the germination of weed seeds. So if you've got weeds that spread by seed and you're mulching correctly, it really does help to control them. And if they do come up, they'll come up in the mulch, and it's much easier to take them out than it is if it's in your soil, because they just kind of pop out of the loose mulch. If you've got weeds that spread through underground stems, if God help you, you've got bindweed, it doesn't do a lot. Those weeds will just pop up as if they just love the mulch. But it is a help. It does control. The other thing it does is it retains moisture in the soil. So water, if you have a lot of flower beds, like big gardens, well, first of all, I would counsel to use drought-tolerant plants, but give them a really good water in the spring, and then mulch, because it does help keep that moisture in. And it also keeps the soil cool in hot weather. The other thing it can do is if you use an organic mulch, and by organic, I'm not talking about like you talk about organically grown. I'm talking about something that was once alive. So if you're using bark, shredded bark, as that breaks down, it actually improves your soil. It improves the soil structure and it can add nutrients. Now, one sort of semi-caution though about mulch. If you're using a very coarse mulch, like wood chips, it actually requires nitrogen to break down. So initially it can take nitrogen from the soil and therefore from being available to your plants. So just be aware of that, because then once the mulch does start to break down, it then feeds the soil. But in that initial period, if you're using a very coarse mulch, you may want to make sure that that there is enough nitrogen in the soil. So you may want to be adding supplemental nitrogen. I think that's all I want to say about mulch. Yes, it is. Some plantering. The reason you're best to water in the morning. All right, you're going to say, well, I can't. What do I do if it rains? I'm not suggesting you go out with umbrellas and keep it away from the plants, because of the problem of wet foliage overnight can cause disease. But as much as possible, if you're actually having to add supplemental water, try to do it in the morning so that it has the rest of the day for the foliage to dry off. It also reduces water loss from evaporation, so the water is doing your plants more, is doing more good to the plants. Got to stop talking so fast, I start getting tongue-tied here. The drip irrigation hoses are best because they provide water directly to the roots. I've tried them. I don't use them. I gave up on using them because I have a lot of gardens and big flower beds, very big flower beds. So I found that the drip irrigation hose that my husband carefully placed for me, kind of around, it took so long. I mean, the thing, I swear, was taking a week and a half to do one flower bed. And all right, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but so I did go back to overhead watering, and I'm ashamed of myself, but I water first thing in the morning, so it's okay. The other thing that I'm very good about doing, though, and I think this is an important point, is you're far better to water less frequently, but water deeply. If you like to go out with a hose and when you get home from work and give her a little sprinkle, what you're doing is you're encouraging the roots to stay close to the surface so that they can get the benefit of that little sprinkle. You're far better to water less often, but water for a couple of hours. I usually water, if we're in a drought period, which we seem to be every summer, I will water once or twice a week, usually twice a week, especially in my vegetable garden. But I'll leave it on, I'll water for a couple of hours. I want it really soaked. And that has the opposite effect from the frequent sprinklings. It encourages the roots to go way down. And that makes them really more drought tolerant because they're down there where where the water stays the longest. And I think that is my last word. And Congratulations. You've been a wonderful class and you've all graduated. So the last slide I'm going to leave you with is really our contact information. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, although we're called Grey County Master Gardeners, we have several members who live in Bruce. As Nancy mentioned, I'm close to Hanover, so we're very close to Bruce County. We also have some right out in the east part of Grey as well. Our raison d'etre is to provide information, advice, answer questions for home gardeners. So if you have a problem in your garden, or even better, if you're interested in becoming a master gardener, do please email us and check out our website, which is quite proud of it. We redid it this year, and I think it's quite an informative website. So, happy gardening.
Jackie, are you ready for some questions?
I am. I hope they're easy.
Well, I don't know the answer, so I guess we'll find out. Well, we had a couple people just write in just to comment and say that the presentation was very interesting and to thank you for doing that, and lots of helpful information. Commenting on the pH test, they thought that was really cool how you can pH test your own soil, which was very neat. So just wanted to pass that along to you, that people were enjoying the presentation as you were talking. So one of the questions had to do with when you were talking about fertilizing the soil. So you mentioned using aged manure, and I wondered, had you ever or do you recommend using a manure tea, where you soak the manure in water and then use the water to feed the soil?
Yes, I don't myself use it, but I know people that do.
Mhm.
That is fine, and you can make it yourself using the manure and soaked in water.
Yeah, yeah. No, I liked that part. That was good. Like talking about manure. Well, that was fantastic, and I know of people that have used manure tea before, too. So, and seem to have good results with it as well. So, yeah, that was kind of interesting, and I like how you mentioned to make sure that it's aged so that you're not burning your plants by accident. Another question along the sorry, go ahead.
Nancy, sorry, could I just back up quickly though on the using the manure tea? You're really feeding your plant because you're watering your plant rather than the soil. But I mean, it's good for the soil. But it's really more of a replacement for the Miracle-Gro sort of thing.
Right. Got it. Awesome. Thank you. So yeah, there was another question along the topic of fertilizing. Somebody had asked a question about eggshells and coffee grounds, and I've heard of people using both of these as fertilizer in their gardens. Recommend? Don't recommend?
Coffee grounds, yes, I do recommend. The only reason I don't recommend eggshells, ground up eggshells can also, by the way, be against slugs and snails. They like to crawl over them. But the problem with eggshells, you have to make sure they're really ground up fine. Because again, there can be an issue around alkalinity, around the pH of the soil, because they have calcium. So again, you're adding calcium to the soil.
Okay, right.
Yeah, and for some reason, and I don't know why the chemical issue would be, but if they're really, really ground up fine, they're okay. But don't just toss your eggshells into your composter and think that you're doing your soil good. You probably are, but only if you have acidic soil.
Right. Okay. Gotcha. Excellent. I also did enjoy the bits that you shared about growing blueberries, and don't grow them unless you're in Northern Ontario, because they do love to grow up there.
Oh yes, yeah. Well, it's granite. They're Canadian Shield, and the Canadian Shield is granite, and that's acidic.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Um, oh, and I just have one more comment. You had mentioned about some of the bulbs, like glads, and how and dahlias, how you dig them up and keep them in over the winter and that sort of thing. And I do have like a recollection of glads in my mother's garden, and she would just leave them in, and they would come back year after year. But I think they weren't consistent, right? Like she would have to replace them from time to time, or some would come back and some wouldn't. Um, but it could have just been like where she had placed them, or how deep she had planted them, or I'm not
it's also
sure.
it's also snow cover.
Right.
Uh, if they're fairly deep and it's a winter where we have good snow cover.
Right.
I had an uncle, and my mother used to just, oh, um, she practically, I think, accused him of lying to her and replanting his glads every year and telling her he was leaving them in. But they lived in Collingwood, and so
Right.
snow cover there, whereas my mother and father were down south of Hamilton. Um, Not reliable snow cover, and so snow cover makes a big difference with the glads.
Right. Right. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, you're probably right. It would make a difference how much snow is on top of the ground that they're resting under for the winter. Um, yeah, so I think that was it for our questions. Jackie, did you have anything else that you wanted to add today?
I don't think so. Um, I know, we master gardeners, we're really hoping that we can get back out there in person soon and be seeing the groups and having our advice clinics, which of course we haven't been able to have. So I really hope to see you all soon.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, well, and we're missing these in person events, right? Because there would be lots of people asking lots of questions too. So, but I do appreciate the ones that were submitted, and thank you to the people who did that today. Appreciate it very much. Oh, and we just got to thank so much. We really enjoyed it. So thanks. That's amazing. Yeah, so just a few little things before we wrap up here. So thank you, of course, to Jackie for taking time and sharing your information with us today. And please feel free to contact Grey County Master Gardeners through their website at www.greycountymastergardeners.com. And they have a Facebook page as well. And they'll be happy to help you out with all your gardening woes. We have many resources available at the library too about gardening, of course, including copies of Grow Without a Garden, 101 Plants for Containers, and that's by Lara Lucretia Rogoski, which the Grey County Master Gardeners have just donated some copies of this book for our library collection. So you'll be able to put a hold on that book and pick it up at one of our locations. And to find other books like that, check out the link on our website to our online catalog, and you can place your holds there. And if you don't have a library card, we've made it super easy to get one. So you can either visit our website and click the link for a temporary card, or you can call your local branch to arrange a curbside registration. Our doors are closed right now, but you can still pick up materials from the library. Call ahead, reserve your materials. Yeah, we've even made arrangements so that you can get a card if you don't have one as well. So lots of things we can still do even though our doors are closed. Our membership is free, and it allows you access to thousands of books and videos and electronic resources like magazines and learning tutorials and so much more. So make sure you go out and you get your library card if you don't have one. Again, we just request you take a minute to fill in our evaluation for the program. Your feedback helps guide our program offerings and reinforce our value in the community, and the link to the form is in the description. And remember to subscribe to the Bruce County Public Library on YouTube, where you can find more live and recorded presentations. We have stories for children, activities you can do at home, check our website events tab for upcoming virtual programs like our Library Talks With on YouTube. On Thursday, May the 6th, May is Museum Month in Ontario, so we've invited the Bruce County Museum and Cultural Centre to be our guest. So their doors may certainly be closed to the public right now, but there's still lots of things happening behind the scenes, and we look forward to finding out more with them on Thursday. And then next week, we bring back David Chapman. You may remember him. He did a presentation with us in February called Wild Birds of Ontario 2. And we had so many requests for Wild Birds of Ontario 1, which he had actually originally done with us in person. So he is going to do that on our YouTube channel for us on Thursday, May 13th at 2 p.m. And that's Wild Birds of Ontario, the first in the series. And last but not least today, just thank you again to our Digital Initiatives Coordinator with all the help behind the scenes today with our tech setup, and to our Communications Coordinator for setting up our YouTube channel and promoting our event. And of course, we want to thank Jackie today and the Grey County Master Gardeners for your excellent presentation and advice and information. And I hope, like you, I am ready to go home and get digging. I've been inspired by all of everything I've heard today. So thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon.